A Short History of the United States by Edward Channing. Chapter 14. Bunker Hill to Trenton. 133. Advantages of the British. At first sight, it seems as if the Americans were very foolish to fight the British. There were 5 or 6 times as many people in the British Isles as there were in the continental colonies. The British government had a great standing army. The Americans had no regular army. The British government had a great navy. The Americans had no navy. The British government had quantities of powder, guns, and clothing, while the Americans had scarcely any military stores of any kind. Indeed, there were so few guns in the colonies that one British officer thought if the few colonial gunsmiths could be bribed to go away, the Americans would have no guns to fight with after a few months of warfare. 134. Advantages of the Americans. All these things were clearly against the Americans, but they had some advantages on their side. In the first place, America was a long way off from Europe. It was very difficult and very costly to send armies to America, and very difficult and very costly to feed the soldiers when they were fighting in America. In the second place, the Americans usually fought on the defensive, and the country over which the armies fought was made for defense. In New England, hill succeeded hill. In the Middle States, river succeeded river. In the South, wilderness succeeded wilderness. In the third place, the Americans had many great soldiers. Washington, Greene, Arnold, Morgan, and Wayne were better soldiers than any in the British army. 135. Disunion among the Americans. We are apt to think of the colonists as united in the contest with the British. In reality, the well-to-do, the well-born, and the well-educated colonists were as a rule opposed to independence. The opponents of the Revolution were strongest in the Carolinas and were weakest in New England. 136. Siege of Boston. It was most fortunate that the British army was at Boston when the war began, for Boston was about as bad a place for an army as could be found. In those days, Boston was hardly more than an island connected with the mainland by a strip of gravel. Gage built a fort across this strip of ground. The Americans could not get in, but they built a fort at the landward end, and the British could not get out. On either side of Boston was a similar peninsula. One of these was called Dorchester Heights. The other was called Charlestown. Both overlooked Boston. To hold that town, Gage must possess both Dorchester and Charlestown. If the Americans could occupy only one of these, the British would have to abandon Boston. At the same moment, Gage made up his mind to seize Dorchester, and the Americans determined to occupy the Charlestown hills. The Americans moved first, and the first battle was fought for the Charlestown hills. 137. Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. When the seamen on the British men of war waked up on the morning of June 17th, the first thing they saw was a redoubt on the top of one of the Charlestown hills. The ships opened fire, but in spite of the balls, Colonel Prescott walked on top of the breastwork while his men went on digging. Gage sent 3,000 or 4,000 men across the Charles River to Charlestown to drive the daring Americans away. It took the whole morning to get them to Charlestown, and then they had to eat their dinner. This delay gave the Americans time to send aid to Prescott. Especially went Stark and his New Hampshire men, who posted themselves behind a breastwork of fence rails and hay. At last the British soldiers marched to the attack. When they came within good shooting distance, Prescott gave the word to fire. The British line stopped, hesitated, broke, and swept back. Again the soldiers marched to the attack, and again they were beaten back. More soldiers came from Boston, and a third time a British line marched up the hill. This time it could not be stopped, for the Americans had no more powder. They had to give up the hill and escape as well as they could. 1/2 of the British soldiers actually engaged in the assaults were killed or wounded. The Americans were defeated, but they were encouraged and were willing to sell Gage as many hills as he wanted at the same price. 138. Washington in command, July 1775. The Continental Congress was again sitting at Philadelphia. It took charge of the defense of the colonies. John Adams named Washington for commander-in-chief, and he was elected. Washington took command of the army on Cambridge Common, July 3, 1775. He found everything in confusion. The soldiers of one colony were jealous of the soldiers of other colonies. Officers who had not been promoted were jealous of those who had been promoted. In the winter, the army had to be made over. During all this time, the people expected Washington to fight, but he had not powder enough for half a battle. At last, he got supplies in the following way. In the spring of 1775, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys, with the help of the people of western Massachusetts and Connecticut, had captured Ticonderoga and Crown Point. These forts were filled with cannon and stores left from the French campaigns. Some of the cannon were now dragged by oxen over the snow and placed in forts around Boston. Captain Manley of the Massachusetts Navy captured a British brig loaded with powder. Washington now could attack. He seized and held Dorchester Heights. The British could no longer stay in Boston. They went on board their ships and sailed away. 139. Invasion of Canada, 1775 to 76. While the siege of Boston was going on, the Americans undertook the invasion of Canada. There were very few regular soldiers in Canada in 1775, and the Canadians were not likely to fight very hard for their British masters. So the leaders in Congress thought that if an American force should suddenly appear before Quebec, the town might surrender. Montgomery, with a small army, was sent to capture Montreal and then to march down the St. Lawrence to Quebec. Benedict Arnold led another force through the Maine woods. After tremendous exertions and terrible sufferings, he reached Quebec. But the garrison had been warned of his coming. He blockaded the town and waited for Montgomery. The garrison was constantly increased, for Arnold was not strong enough to fully blockade the town. At last Montgomery arrived. At night, amidst a terrible snowstorm, Montgomery and Arnold led their brave followers to the attack. They were beaten back with cruel loss. Montgomery was killed, and Arnold was severely wounded. In the spring of 1776, the survivors of this little band of heroes were rescued, at the cost of the lives of 5,000 American soldiers. 140. British attack on Charleston, 1776. In June 1776, a British fleet and army made an attack on Charleston, South Carolina. This town has never been taken by attack from the sea. Sandbars guard the entrance of the harbor, and the channels through these shoals lead directly to the end of Sullivan's Island. At that point, the Americans built a fort of palmetto logs and sand. General Moultrie commanded at the fort, and it was named in his honor, Fort Moultrie. The British fleet sailed boldly in, but the balls from the ship's gun were stopped by the soft palmetto logs. At one time, the flag was shot away and fell down outside the fort. But Sergeant Jasper rushed out, seized the broken staff, and again set it up on the rampart. Meantime, General Clinton had landed on an island and was trying to cross with the soldiers to the further end of Sullivan's Island. But the water was at first too shoal for the boats. The soldiers jumped overboard to wade. Suddenly the water deepened, and they had to jump aboard to save themselves from drowning. All this time the Americans were firing at them from the beach. General Clinton ordered a retreat. The fleet also sailed out, all that could get away, and the whole expedition was abandoned. 141. Long Island and Brooklyn Heights, 1776. The very day that the British left Boston, Washington ordered 5 regiments to New York, for he well knew that city would be the next point of attack. But he need not have been in such a hurry. General Howe, the new British commander-in-chief, sailed first to Halifax, and did not begin the campaign in New York until the end of August. He then landed his soldiers on Long Island and prepared to drive the Americans away. Marching in a roundabout way, he cut the American army in two and captured one part of it. This brought him to the foot of Brooklyn Heights. On the top was a fort. Probably Howe could have easily captured it, But he had led in the field at Bunker Hill and had had enough of attacking forts defended by Americans. So he stopped his soldiers with some difficulty. That night the wind blew a gale, and the next day was foggy. The British fleet could not sail into the East River. Skillful fishermen safely ferried the rest of the American army across to New York. When at length the British marched to the attack, there was no one left in the fort on Brooklyn Heights. 142. From the Hudson to the Delaware, 1776. Even now, with his splendid fleet and great army, Howe could have captured the Americans. But he delayed so long that Washington got away in safety. Washington's army was now fast breaking up. Soldiers deserted by the hundreds. A severe action at White Plains only delayed the British advance. The fall of Fort Washington on the end of Manhattan Island destroyed all hope of holding anything near New York. Washington sent one part of his army to secure the highlands of the Hudson, while the other part he retired across New Jersey to the southern side of the Delaware River. The end of the war seemed to be in sight. In December 1776, Congress gave the sole direction of the war to Washington and then left Philadelphia for a place of greater safety. 143. Trenton, December 26, 1776. Washington did not give up. On Christmas night, 1776, he crossed the Delaware with a division of his army. A violent snowstorm was raging, and the river was full of ice. But Washington was there in person, and the soldiers crossed. Then the storm changed to sleet and rain. But on the soldiers marched. When the Hessian garrison at Trenton looked about them the next morning, they saw that Washington and Greene held the roads leading inland from the town. Stark and a few soldiers, among them James Monroe, held the bridge leading over to the Assunpink to the next British post. A few horsemen escaped before Stark could prevent them, but all the foot soldiers were killed or captured. A few days later, nearly 1,000 prisoners marched through Philadelphia. They were Germans who had been sold by their rulers to Britain's king to fight his battles. They were called Hessians by the Americans because most of them came from the little German state of Hesse-Kassel. 144. Princeton, January, 1777. Trenton saved the Revolution by giving the Americans renewed courage. General Howe sent Lord Cornwallis with a strong force to destroy the Americans. Washington, with the main part of his army, was now encamped on the southern side of the Assunpink. Cornwallis was on the other bank at Trenton. Leaving a few men to keep up the campfires and to throw up a slight fort by the bridge over the stream, Washington led his army away by night toward Princeton. There he found several regiments hastening to Cornwallis. He drove them away and led his army to the highlands of New Jersey, where he would be free from attack. The British abandoned nearly all their posts in New Jersey and retired to New York.